The moment my son announced I'm going to marry a woman who has been unconscious for a year, I thought he had completely lost his mind. I slammed my hand on the table and shouted, "You're throwing away your future for someone who can't even respond to you." But my wife calmly held my arm and whispered, "Let him keep the promise he made to her." Against my instincts, I agreed to attend the wedding. But when the ceremony began, and my wife suddenly stood up with a file in her hands, not to reveal the truth, but to bury my son with it. Thank you for being here. It means everything. Now, tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from today? Let's see how far Revenge Dad reaches. Some elements of this story are fictional, added for storytelling and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but the message waiting for you at the end is one I believe you'll carry with you. I have sent men to prison for the rest of their lives, and never once lost sleep over it. I have looked murderers in the eye from the bench, and delivered verdicts that made grown men weep. For 40 years the law was my compass, my anchor, the one thing I trusted above all else. But nothing, not one case in 4 decades, shook me the way my own son did on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. My name is Theodore Hargrove. I am 70 years old, a retired Chief Justice of the Connecticut Superior Court, and the father of a man I thought I knew completely. That afternoon proved me wrong in ways I am still reckoning with. It started the way all disasters do, quietly. Owen called the family meeting himself, which should have been my first warning. My son is not a man who calls meetings. He is not a man who gathers people in living rooms and clears his throat before speaking. Owen Hargrove communicates in 3-word sentences, closed doors, and the kind of steady eye contact that makes business partners nervous. So, when Edmund, our housekeeper of 22 years, appeared in the doorway of my study and told me Owen had asked us all to come downstairs, I set down my fountain pen and felt the first cold finger of unease press against the back of my neck. The living room of the Hargrove estate had been arranged with unusual care. Owen stood near the fireplace, still in his work clothes, charcoal suit, no tie sleeves rolled to the elbow. He held nothing in his hands. His face was the face I had seen him wear in boardrooms when he was about to deliver news nobody wanted to hear. Margaret was already seated on the cream settee near the window. My wife of 8 years looked up when I entered and offered me the gentle practiced smile she reserved for difficult occasions. She was 62 and still carried herself with the kind of polished composure that made people instinctively lower their voices around her. She patted the cushion beside her, and I sat, and the unease in my chest sharpened into something closer to dread. Edmund stood near the hallway entrance, his hands folded in front of him. The old man's face was carefully blank, the expression of a man who had overheard something he wished he hadn't. Owen waited until the room settled. Then he said it. "I'm going to marry Claire, formally, with a ceremony here at the house." The words landed like a gavel on hardwood. Claire Donovan, Owen's fiancée, 26 years old, a sharp-eyed financial auditor who had walked into our lives 2 years ago with a battered leather satchel and an uncanny ability to find errors in documents that 3 certified accountants had already cleared. A young woman I had grown genuinely fond of. A young woman who had been lying in a private care facility in Fairfield County for the past 12 months, unresponsive following a car accident on Route 44 that the doctors described with increasing grimness as having no clear path to recovery. I was on my feet before I realized I had stood up. "Owen!" My voice came out harder than I intended, the courtroom voice, the one that had silenced defense attorneys mid-sentence for 4 decades. "Have you lost your mind entirely?" Owen did not flinch. He met my eyes with that unreadable steadiness that had always, even when he was a boy, made me feel like I was arguing with a wall. "No," he said. "I haven't. She is in a coma." The words felt brutal leaving my mouth, but I needed him to hear them. "She cannot speak. She cannot consent. She cannot walk down an aisle or say vows or—" My throat tightened against my will, and I pressed through it. "Son, what you're describing is not a wedding. It is theater. And I will not stand in front of a priest and participate in—" "I want to give her a legal name," Owen said, cutting me off with a quietness that was somehow worse than shouting. "I want her to be my wife on paper before—" He stopped, swallowed. For one unguarded second, something raw moved across his face, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something a father recognizes in his child, even when the child has done everything in his power to bury it. "Before it's too late," he finished. My chest cracked open a little at that. I did not want it to. I am a man who built a career on keeping his chest firmly closed. "Owen." "Theo!" Margaret's voice came from the settee, soft, warm, the particular gentle timbre she used when she wanted to ease tension from a room. She rose and crossed to me, placing her hand lightly on my forearm. Her perfume was faint and expensive. Let him do this. Let the boy honor her the only way he can right now. She looked up at me, and her eyes were just slightly wet at the corners, not crying, never quite crying, just enough to make the emotion seem genuine. Let him finish what he started with her, please. The please undid me. I am not proud of that. I looked at my son, this quiet, stubborn, infuriating man who had sat beside Claire Donovan's hospital bed every single Sunday for 12 months, driving himself out to Fairfield County in the early morning before the traffic thickened, sitting for hours in a chair that was too small for him, and reading to her from whatever book she had last recommended before the accident. I knew because Edmund had told me. Owen had never mentioned it once. My jaw ached from clenching it. I pressed my hand briefly over Margaret's and then stepped away, moving to the window, staring out at the lawn where the October light was beginning to go, amber and long. When? I asked the glass. 2 weeks, Owen said. I kept my eyes on the yard. The old oak near the stone wall had begun to turn its leaves, going the color of rust. I'll stand in, I said finally. I'll be there for him, whatever he needs from me that day. But Owen... I turned back to face him, and I let him see whatever was happening in my eyes because I was 70 years old and too tired to hide it entirely. If this causes her family distress, if there is any legal complication, if this is not... It won't be, Owen said. 3 words, a closed door. I nodded, and I told myself I was doing it for my son. I did not yet understand that Margaret had reasons of her own for wanting this wedding to happen. But that night alone in the dark, I came closer to understanding my son than I had in years. Sleep refused me. It had been refusing me since the family meeting, actually hovering just out of reach every time I closed my eyes, replaced instead by the image of Owen standing near the fireplace with his sleeves rolled up and his face carved into that expression of absolute immovable certainty. I lay in the dark of the master bedroom for 2 hours listening to the old house settle around me before I finally gave up, pulled on my robe, and padded down the hallway to my study. The room smelled of old paper and leather, binding the smell of 40 years of case files of brief after brief, stacked on every available surface before Eleanor made me install proper shelving. I had not redecorated since she died. I told myself it was because the arrangement was efficient. That was not entirely true. I sat down behind the desk and reached for the pen I had set down 2 weeks ago when Edmund summoned me downstairs. It had rolled to the back of the central drawer. I pulled the drawer open and searched with my fingers and found instead an envelope, cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges. My name written across the front in handwriting I would have recognized from across a crowded room. Theodore, not Theo. She only wrote Theodore when she was being serious. My hands, these hands that had held a gavel for 40 years without trembling, began to shake. Eleanor Hargrove had written the letter 14 months before she died, 12 years ago, when the diagnosis had moved from something manageable to something that wasn't. She had pressed it into the back of this drawer herself and told me not to look for it. I had respected that. I had not looked. But I had also, in 12 years of reaching into this drawer for pens and paper clips and the reading glasses I kept losing, never once found it. I turned the envelope over in my hands for a long moment. Then I opened it. Her handwriting was careful, and even Eleanor had always written the way she did, everything with deliberate, unhurried attention. Theo, she wrote, if you're reading this, it means one of 2 things. Either you went looking, which I told you not to do, or you found it by accident, which means you needed to find it. I'm going to assume the second, because you were always better at following instructions than you let on. My chest hurt so badly I pressed my fist against it. I want to tell you something about Owen. You probably think you know him completely. You've studied him his whole life the way you study everything, analytically, carefully, looking for the pattern underneath the behavior. But there's one thing about our boy that I don't think your method will ever fully capture, and I want you to hear it from me while I can still say it clearly. When Owen was 8 years old, he found a thrush in the backyard with a broken wing. You remember this. You told him it probably wouldn't survive, and you were being honest, and that was the right thing to say. But Owen sat with that bird for 3 days. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for help. He just sat with it morning and evening, talking to it in that quiet way he has, giving it water with an eyedropper he found in my sewing kit. The bird lived, Theo. It lived because our son decided it would. What I'm trying to tell you is this. Owen does not love halfway. He never has. When he commits to something, to someone, he commits the way that 8-year-old boy committed to a broken bird in our backyard. Completely. Without reservation. Without any guarantee of a good outcome. So, if there comes a day when he loves someone and you don't understand why he's doing what he's doing, trust him anyway. Trust that the boy who sat with that bird for 3 days knows something about holding on that the rest of us are still learning. Love, Eleanor. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the lamp to feel very bright and very far away. Long enough for the tightness in my throat to win the argument I was trying to have with it, and for my eyes to sting in a way I hadn't let them sting in a very long time. I pressed the heels of my hands against my face and breathed one breath too, until I had myself back under control. Owen had been driving to Fairfield County every Sunday for 12 months, reading to her, sitting in a chair that was too small for him. He commits the way that 8-year-old boy committed to a broken bird. When I finally looked up, the clock on the mantel read 4:47 in the morning. I folded Eleanor's letter carefully along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in my breast pocket rather than the drawer. I did not examine why. I went upstairs, showered, and dressed the gray wool suit I had worn the morning I was sworn in as Chief Justice, because some days require a kind of armor, and I had learned to recognize them. When I came back down, Margaret was already in the hallway, dressed and composed, a cup of coffee held in both hands. She looked at my suit, and something moved across her face, satisfaction perhaps, or relief, and she said with that warm, unhurried smile, "I knew you'd do the right thing, Theo." I said nothing. I took the coffee she offered and I drank it, and I listened to the way she had phrased that sentence. Not, "I knew you'd be there for Owen." Not, "I knew you'd support your son." The right thing. The right thing for whom I wondered, but the question dissolved before I could examine it. Because Owen appeared at the bottom of the stairs, and his face just for a moment, just for the space of one unguarded second, looked like relief so enormous it was almost grief. I cleared my throat. "Let's get this done," I said. And the three of us walked into whatever was waiting for us on the other side of that morning. What was waiting turned out to be flowers. White roses, specifically dozens of them, arranged along the window ledges of the main hall in low crystal vases that caught the pale October light and threw it in fragments across the hardwood floor. Owen had arranged them himself, Edmund told me sweetly, as I took my position near the fireplace. Owen had driven to the florist in Westport before dawn. He had carried the boxes in from the car himself, 3 trips up the front steps in the cold, and had spent an hour positioning each vase before anyone else in the house was awake. "He didn't ask for help," I said. Edmund's expression shifted, that slight compression of the lips that, in 22 years, I had learned to read, as there is more to this than I am able to say. "No, sir," he said. "He didn't." I filed that away and turned to face the room. Father Daniel O'Brien stood at the center of the space we had cleared, of furniture, a tall man in his mid-60s with silver hair, and the particular brand of weathered patience that comes from a lifetime of presiding over other people's most difficult moments. He had buried Eleanor 12 years ago. He had baptized Owen 38 years before that. When I had called him 2 weeks ago to explain the situation, he had listened without interruption, and when I finished, he said only, "I'll be there. Theo, whatever this is, I'll be there." Whatever this is, even Father O'Brien hadn't been sure what to call it. The guests, if you could call them that, were sparse. 3 of Owen's closest colleagues sat in the chairs arranged along the left wall, their expressions carefully neutral, in the way of people who have been told to be supportive and aren't entirely sure what they're supporting. On the right, 2 nurses from Fairfield County who had cared for Claire and who Owen had specifically asked to attend. They sat with their hands folded and their eyes already bright. And then the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the wheelchair came through. My throat closed. The woman in the chair was dressed in ivory, a simple dress, long-sleeved against the October chill, with Claire's favorite pale blue ribbon, threaded through the bouquet of white roses in her lap. A veil of heavy ivory fabric covered her face completely. Her hands rested motionless against the arms of the chair, pushed by Rosa Medina, a compact, dark-haired woman in her mid-30s, who had been Claire's primary care nurse for the past year, and whose face above her white uniform was a study in barely contained emotion. Rosa's jaw was set hard. Her eyes were fixed on a point above everyone's heads, the way people hold themselves together when they are one kind word away from falling apart. Owen stepped forward to meet them at the end of the makeshift aisle. He didn't reach for the veil. He didn't touch Claire's hand. He simply stood beside the wheelchair, facing Father O'Brien, with his shoulders squared and his chin level, and I watched my son from across the room and felt Eleanor's letter pressing against my ribs from the inside of my breast pocket. He commits completely, without any guarantee of a good outcome. Father O'Brien began. He kept the ceremony brief, mercifully, blessedly brief, moving through the words with the practiced steadiness of a man who understood that the point was not the ritual, but the intention behind it. The two nurses on the right side of the room were crying openly by the third sentence. I was not crying. I was standing with my feet planted and my hands clasped behind my back, the posture I had maintained on the bench for 4 decades, and I was using every ounce of discipline I had accumulated in 70 years to keep my face composed. Father O'Brien reached the question, the one that has ended weddings and started wars and cracked open secrets that people spent years keeping sealed. If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, he said in the measured formal cadence the question demands, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. 2 seconds of silence. Then the sound of a chair scraping back. Margaret rose from her seat in a single fluid motion, not the hesitant half-rise of someone uncertain, not the slow unfolding of a person who has changed their mind mid-stand. She rose the way a person rises when they have been waiting for a specific moment, and that moment has finally precisely arrived. One hand went into the structured leather bag on her lap. She produced a folder, dark blue, thick, the kind of folder that contains multiple documents, and held it in front of her like a shield, or perhaps like a weapon. I do, she said. Her voice was perfectly steady, perfectly warm, the voice of a woman doing something painful out of love. Every head in the room turned. I felt the blood drain from my face and then rush back so quickly that my vision swam for a moment. I gripped the mantelpiece behind me with one hand and said in a voice I barely recognized, Margaret, I'm sorry, Theo. She looked at me, and her eyes were sorrowful and soft and full of something that I would have called genuine anguish, if I had not in 40 years on the bench learned that anguish is among the easiest of emotions to perform. I should have said something sooner. I tried to protect Owen. I tried to protect this family. But I can't stand here and watch this happen. She opened the folder and held up the first document. Owen has been consulting with an estate attorney for the past 4 months about the process of obtaining emergency medical guardianship over Claire Donovan. Her voice carried clearly through the hall. No theater, no excess, just facts delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed them. As Claire's legal spouse, he would have automatic authority to make all medical decisions on her behalf, including the decision to withdraw life support. She paused. Let that land. Claire has a $10 million life insurance policy. Owen is the sole name beneficiary. One of Owen's colleagues made a sound, a sharp involuntary intake of breath. Then furthermore, Margaret continued, her voice never wavering. I have reason to believe that the accident on Route 44 last September was not an accident. I have reason to believe that Claire's car was tampered with before she got in it that morning. She lowered the folder and looked at Owen directly for the first time. I believe my stepson caused that accident, and I believe he is attempting to use this marriage to finish what he started. The room came apart. Both nurses were on their feet. Father O'Brien had gone the color of chalk. Owen's colleagues were talking over each other in urgent, overlapping voices, and through it all, Owen stood exactly where he had been standing beside the wheelchair, beside the woman in the ivory dress. And he had not moved a single inch, and his face had not changed by a single degree. And that stillness in the middle of all that chaos was the most frightening thing I had ever seen my son do. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. My hand tightened on the mantelpiece until my knuckles ached. 40 years of reading people from a bench. 40 years of watching the guilty and the innocent under pressure, and I could not for the life of me tell which one my son was. The chaos lasted 11 seconds. I counted because counting was the only thing keeping me upright. Owen's colleagues were still talking. One of the nurses had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, as though she was trying to hold her heart in place. Father O'Brien had taken a step backward, his prayer book clutched to his chest, his face the color of old plaster. Margaret stood with her folder held open, her posture immaculate, her expression calibrated to the precise degree of reluctant righteousness. The look of a person who has done a terrible thing and convinced themselves it was mercy. And Owen had not moved. He stood beside the wheelchair with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked at Margaret the way I had seen experienced surgeons look at a procedure they had already completed in their heads 3 times before picking up the scalpel with the absolute unruffled calm of someone for whom this moment held no surprises whatsoever. That was when my stomach dropped straight through the floor. Not because I thought he was guilty, but because I suddenly viscerally understood that my son had known this was coming. Owen. My voice cut through the noise in the room like a gavel strike, and 30 years of courtroom reflex brought everyone to attention before they'd made the conscious decision to stop talking. What is happening? Owen turned to look at me, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, he let me see something on his face, not guilt, not fear, not the cornered desperation of a man whose plan has unraveled. What I saw was relief. The tight, exhausted, deeply private relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, at last, been permitted to set it down. "Watch," he said. He turned back to the wheelchair. Both hands came up, and with a steadiness that made my throat ache, he reached for the ivory veil and lifted it away. Rosa Medina looked back at him. Not Claire, Rosa. The nurse. The woman who had pushed the chair through those doors 40 minutes ago, with her jaw set and her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She had removed the pale blue ribbon from the bouquet at some point during the ceremony and tucked it into her uniform pocket. Now she sat with her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes calm, and she looked at me directly across the room and said in a voice that carried all the way to the back wall, "Judge," she caught herself, steadied her voice. "Judge Hargrove, Claire is safe. She is alive and being cared for at a secure location. She was never here today." The sound that came out of one of Owen's colleagues was something between a laugh and a sob. The nurse who had been pressing her hand to her heart made a noise like she'd been struck. Margaret's folder dropped 2 inches. Just 2. But I saw it. Owen reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a document folded in thirds the way documents come when they've been handled many times. He unfolded it and held it up with both hands so the room could see. "This is a notarized agreement," he said, his voice carrying the flat, precise clarity of a man who has rehearsed these words until they stopped feeling like words and started feeling like facts. It was prepared by 3 independent attorneys and filed with the Connecticut Secretary of State's office 14 days ago. In the event of Claire Donovan's death, under any circumstances, 100% of her life insurance proceeds and all assets held in her name transfer directly to the Eleanor Hargrove Charitable Foundation. He lowered the document slightly and looked at the room. "I received nothing. I have waived all claims in writing and triplicate in the presence of witnesses and a notary public. The Foundation's board has a copy. Claire's own attorney has a copy, and the Secretary of State's office has a copy." He paused. The silence in that room was the loudest thing I had heard since Eleanor died. Then Owen turned and he looked at Margaret, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I didn't organize this ceremony because I wanted Claire's money," he said. His voice was quiet now. Not angry, something colder than angry, something precise and deliberate and terrible, in the way that truth is sometimes terrible when it finally comes out in the open. "I organized it because someone has been poisoning Claire, slowly, carefully, in a way designed to look like a natural decline." His gaze did not leave Margaret's face. "I needed that person to believe they had a reason to act before this wedding was finalized. I needed them to feel the clock running out." He tilted his head just slightly. "And I needed them to show themselves, to stand up in front of witnesses and make a move that could be documented." He let that land. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, "for being the only person in this room who stood up." Margaret's composure fractured. Not shattered, she was too controlled for that, but fractured, a hairline crack running through the careful architecture of her expression, and for just 1 second, I saw something underneath it that turned my blood to ice water. Not innocence wrongly accused, not a woman blindsided by a monstrous implication. Something calculating, something that was already moving, already planning its next step. It was gone in an instant. Her face rearranged itself into wounded dignity, and she pressed one hand to her collarbone and said in a voice that trembled beautifully, "Owen, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is what Rosa." Owen spoke over her without raising his voice. "Thank you. You can go." Rosa Medina stood from the wheelchair, smoothed her uniform, and walked out of the room with her chin up and her shoulders back, and she didn't look at Margaret once. At the doorway, she paused, turned back to me, and her eyes were fierce and bright and burning, with something that might have been fury on Claire's behalf. "She's going to be okay," Rosa said. Just that. Then she was gone. I stood at the fireplace with Eleanor's letter against my ribs and my hands shaking so hard I had to press them flat against my thighs to make them stop. Father O'Brien was murmuring something, a prayer perhaps, or just words, just the sound of a human voice trying to fill a room that felt like it had been scraped hollow. Owen met my eyes across the space between us. I thought about a boy sitting in a backyard for 3 days beside a broken bird. I thought about the word completely. And in the place where certainty had been something new and unwieldy and enormous began to take root, something that felt against all my better judgment, dangerously close to hope. The rest of that morning was a controlled demolition. Margaret left the house within 20 minutes of the ceremony ending, not fleeing, never anything so graceless as fleeing, but departing with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who had somewhere more important to be and intended everyone to notice. She paused in the entryway to collect her coat from Edmund, and she said to the room in general, in a voice wound tight with injured dignity, "I hope when this is over that someone in this family has the decency to apologize." Then she walked out, and the sound of her heels on the front steps was the most precise and purposeful sound I had ever heard. Owen's colleagues left the next in low murmurs and backward glances. Father O'Brien stayed long enough to press my hand between both of his and say very quietly, "Call me when you need me, Theo, day or night." Then he was gone too, and the house settled into the particular, exhausted silence of a place where something seismic has just occurred. I spent the afternoon in my study. I did not call anyone. I did not read. I sat in the chair where I had read Eleanor's letter 8 hours ago, and I turned everything over in my mind the way I had turned evidence for 40 years, methodically, without sentiment, looking for the shape of what was true underneath the shape of what appeared to be true. By 6 in the evening, I had my answer. I went upstairs and knocked on the door of Owen's home office. "Come in," he said, and I did. He was seated behind his desk in his shirt sleeves. His jacket hung on the back of the chair, a glass of bourbon at his elbow that looked like it had been poured some time ago and not touched since. The room smelled of leather and whatever Owen used on his desk, some particular Polish that had been in the house since Eleanor's time. He looked up when I entered, and something in his posture shifted, not quite relaxing, but acknowledging. "I was wondering how long you'd need," he said. "6 hours," I said. "Sit down." He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that from Owen amounted to the same thing. "I'm already sitting, D." He stopped himself. "I'm already sitting." I pulled the chair from the corner and positioned it across the desk from him, and I sat and I looked at my son the way I had looked at witnesses for 4 decades, directly, without apology, waiting. Owen held my gaze without flinching. He always had. "You made her show herself," I said. "Margaret, that was the point of the ceremony." "Yes. You've known for some time that someone was poisoning Claire." "Since January." His voice was steady, but something moved behind his eyes. Pain tightly controlled, the kind that comes from months of carrying a terrible knowledge alone. I noticed the patterns in her test results in December. The decline wasn't consistent with the initial diagnosis. It was too regular, too incremental. It looked like a schedule. My stomach turned. "You didn't come to me." "No." He picked up the bourbon glass, looked at it, set it back down without drinking. "Because I knew what you'd do. You'd confront her directly, or you'd call the police, and without forensic evidence, it would have been my word against hers. She would have denied it, cleaned everything up overnight, and we would have lost the only advantage we had, the fact that she didn't know we knew." He was right. I hated that he was right, and I hated more that I recognized the logic immediately, because it was exactly the logic I would have applied in his position if I had been thinking like a prosecutor instead of like a father. "You contacted someone," I said. "You didn't sit on this alone for 9 months. You're too careful for that." Owen looked at me for a moment. Then he opened the center drawer of his desk and slid a business card across the surface toward me. I picked it up. "Dennis Kowalski, Special Agent, Financial Crimes Division, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Hartford Field Office." "I called him in January," Owen said, "the day after I first looked at Claire's blood work results with an independent toxicologist. Kowalski has been running a parallel investigation for 9 months, financial forensics, surveillance, the works. Everything by the book, everything with proper authorization, everything that will hold up in a federal court." He leaned forward slightly. I didn't handle this alone, and I didn't handle it outside the law. I was very careful about that. The relief that moved through me was so enormous it made my hands unsteady. I set the business card down on the desk and pressed my palms flat against my thighs, the same gesture I'd used this morning to stop my hands from shaking in front of the guests. "Obstruction of justice," I said. "Exactly what I was trying to avoid," Owen said, "which is why the first call I made in January was to the FBI and not to you. I needed cover, legal cover. If I had gone to you first and you had acted even with the best intentions, we could have compromised the investigation." I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth the way I had trained myself to do in the middle of difficult trials when the evidence was moving faster than the procedure could accommodate. "All right," I said. "What do we have?" Owen's expression shifted, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I saw the version of my son who ran a company with 400 employees and had never in 15 years of business lost a contract he decided he wanted to keep. Focused, precise, completely dangerously awake. "We have 9 months of financial surveillance," he said. "We have toxicological evidence of a substance that shouldn't be in Claire's system. We have a pattern of access that points to one person. What we don't have yet," he paused, "is a direct evidentiary link, something that puts her hand on the mechanism, something a jury convicts on." "Then that's what we build," I said. There were operational details Owen hadn't shared yet. Specifics about Claire's location, about what was already in place. He would tell me when I needed to know. I understood that, and I let it stand. I picked up the business card again and turned it over. Dennis Kowalski, Hartford Field Office. I had testified in front of FBI agents for 30 years. I knew what a good one looked like, and the card felt like the card of a careful man. No personal cell number, no title inflation, just the facts. "Call him," I said. "Tonight. Tell him Theodore Hargrove wants a meeting. Tell him I spent 40 years building cases that held up on appeal, and I'd like to put that experience to use." I set the card back on the desk and stood, and the old bones in my knees protested the way they always did these days, and I ignored them the way I always did. "And Owen," he looked up. "Next time?" I said, "You come to me first. We find a way to do it right together. You don't carry this kind of thing alone." Owen's jaw tightened, not in refusal, in something more complicated than refusal. The look of a man who had decided 9 months ago that protecting the people he loved meant bearing the weight of it by himself, and who was only now beginning to consider that he might have been wrong about that. "Yeah," he said very quietly. "Okay." It was the most I was going to get. With Owen, it always was. I left him there with his untouched bourbon and went to bed for the first time in 36 hours, and as I lay in the dark, I thought about what Margaret had said on her way out the door. "I hope someone has the decency to apologize." I thought about the look beneath her composure, that fraction of a second of cold calculation before the wounded dignity snapped back into place. Then I thought about Dennis Kowalski's business card sitting on my son's desk, and I closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. Dennis Kowalski was not what I expected. I had worked alongside FBI agents for the better part of 4 decades, testified in their cases, reviewed their evidence, occasionally sent their work back to them with annotations. When the chain of custody had gaps I couldn't defend from the bench. In my experience, the good ones shared certain qualities: economy of movement, a particular quality of watchfulness, and the habit of asking the second question before most people had finished answering the first. Kowalski had all of that compressed into a 45-year-old man in a gray wool suit who poured his own coffee from the carafe on the conference table without asking anyone's permission and said, before he sat down, "I've read everything Owen sent me last night. Let's skip the summary and get to what you actually need." I decided immediately that I liked him. The Hartford Field Office conference room was unremarkable drop ceiling, fluorescent light. A whiteboard with the ghost of someone else's case still faintly visible beneath the eraser marks. Owen sat to my left. Kowalski sat across from us with a legal pad and a pen that he clicked once and then set down, apparently deciding he wouldn't need it. 8 years, Kowalski said, opening the folder in front of him. "That's how far back we've been able to pull Margaret Sinclair's history. Not Sinclair Hargrove, Sinclair, before she became your wife." He slid a document across the table. I picked it up. It was a billing record from a law firm in Stamford, Whitfield, and associate specialists in matrimonial property law. The date at the top was was March 2017, 6 months before Margaret had accepted my proposal. She retained a matrimonial attorney to analyze Connecticut's prenuptial agreement statutes before she agreed to marry you, Kowalski said, with the flat, unhurried delivery of a man who has learned to give people time to absorb information before he adds to it. Specifically, she wanted to understand what a properly constructed prenup could and couldn't be challenged on, what assets it could protect, what it couldn't touch. He paused. She knew exactly what she was walking into when she walked into your house, Judge. The word judge landed differently than it usually did. Not as a title, as a reminder. I set the document down carefully. My jaw ached. She knew she couldn't break the prenup. Owen said, his voice level. So she needed another way. Correct, Kowalski said, which brings us to the Hargrove Family Foundation accounts. He slid a second document across a spreadsheet dense with figures. Over the past 18 months, approximately $5 million moved out of the foundation's primary operating account through a series of transactions structured to look like legitimate grant disbursements. The receiving entity's 4 nonprofits in 3 states turn out to be shells. Empty. No staff, no programming, no physical address that checks out. My vision went slightly strange at the edges. $5 million. $5 million that donors had given to a foundation bearing my family's name, believing it would go to causes Eleanor had cared about, literacy programs and children's hospitals and college scholarships for kids in underfunded districts. Claire found it, Owen said. It wasn't a question. Claire found it, Kowalski confirmed. Last March, she was conducting a routine independent audit. Your foundation's board had contracted her firm for an annual review. According to her preliminary notes, which we recovered from her encrypted work drive, she identified the anomalies within the first 48 hours. He looked at me steadily. She filed a preliminary report with the foundation board on March 14th. She was in a car accident on Route 44 on March 21st. 7 days. 7 days between Claire finding the evidence and someone ensuring that Claire would no longer be in any position to present it. I pressed my hands flat on the table because they had started to shake again, and I was tired of my hands betraying me. There's more, Kowalski said, and something in his tone made me brace. We pulled the filings at the Fairfield County Probate Court. 3 weeks after Claire was admitted to the hospital, while she was unresponsive and had no family representative present, someone submitted an application for health care power of attorney on her behalf. He slid a third document across. I looked at the signature line. Claire E. Donovan. That is not Claire's signature, Owen said, and the quiet fury in his voice was the closest I had heard him come to losing his composure in 5 days. I have 32 samples of her handwriting. I've looked at this document 100 times. That is not her signature. Our forensic document examiner agrees, Kowalski said. The signature was traced likely from Claire's driver's license, which was in her personal belongings at the hospital. Under Connecticut law, a health care power of attorney grants the holder authority to make all medical decisions for an incapacitated person, including decisions about life-sustaining treatment. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Margaret Sinclair Hargrove has had that authority for 11 months. We later confirmed she had used her position as a longtime donor to expedite the filing, and that the notary seal on the document is a forgery. Our forensic examiner matched it to a stamp reported stolen from a Stamford law office in August of last year. That forgery is a separate federal charge. A single clerk, since suspended, processed the paperwork without running the standard verification protocol. The room felt very small suddenly. I thought about Margaret walking into Fairfield County Hospital with that warm, practiced smile, flashing her documentation at the nursing station. Being waved through to Claire's room without a second glance because the paperwork was in order and the paperwork said she belonged there. Owen's phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it and something changed in his face, a tightening around the eyes that I had learned over the course of this week to read as significant. "It's Carol Stanton," he said. "She's outside." Kowalski nodded once he had clearly been expecting this and went to the door. Carol Stanton was 52 years old, with the build and bearing of a woman who had spent 3 decades on hospital floors and had long since stopped apologizing for taking up space. She was the nursing supervisor at Fairfield County Private, and she walked into the conference room with a manila folder pressed to her chest, and the expression of someone who has made a decision they know will cost them something, and has decided to make it anyway. I should have come forward sooner, she said, before anyone spoke. Her voice was steady, but her hands on that folder were not. I want you to know that. I saw things that didn't add up, and I told myself there were explanations, and She stopped, pressed her lips together hard. There weren't explanations. I knew that. I just didn't want to be the person who said it out loud. She set the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed records, medication logs, nursing notes, internal pharmacy requests. These medications were ordered for Claire Donovan's treatment, she said, pointing to a highlighted column. But they're not in her official care plan. They were never authorized by her attending physician. The order codes trace back to a secondary access credential that was created when the healthcare power of attorney was filed. Her finger moved to the next column. And this compound in these concentrations administered at these intervals is not treatment. It's maintenance. It's keeping someone right at the edge of unconsciousness without tipping them over. Kowalski leaned forward. When did you first notice the discrepancy? 4 months ago, Carol Stanton said, and now her voice cracked just once, just slightly, a fracture that she sealed up immediately with a sharp breath. 4 months ago, and I didn't say anything, and I'm going to have to live with that. She looked at Owen directly, and her eyes were bright and anguished. She should have woken up 6 months ago, Mr. Hargrove. By every clinical marker I know she should have woken up. Owen said nothing, but the muscle in his jaw moved in a way that told me everything about what that sentence caused him to hear. I picked up Carol Stanton's folder and looked at the numbers on the page, and I thought about 8 years of breakfast and dinner parties and charity galas, and the way Margaret's hand had felt on my arm in the living room 2 weeks ago when she said, "Let him finish what he started with her," and the satisfaction that had moved across her face in the hallway yesterday morning when she saw me in my gray suit. I knew you'd do the right thing, Theo. 8 years, and I had not seen a single inch of it. My chest didn't hurt this time. My chest had gone somewhere past, hurting into a place that was very quiet and very cold and very, very clear. "Tell me," I said to Kowalski, "what we need to do next." He told it with a folder. He always told things with folders. This one was thinner than the others, just 12 pages, but the kind of 12 pages that weigh more than a full case file. He slid it across the conference table the following morning and let Owen and me read in our own time, which I appreciated because some information requires a moment of private reckoning before it can be discussed out loud. The compound was called tetrodotoxin, TTX in the shorthand, a naturally occurring neurotoxin found most commonly in pufferfish, odorless, colorless, extraordinarily potent in high doses and in low doses, administered consistently over time, capable of producing a state of profound neurological suppression that mimicked in every clinically observable way a coma of traumatic origin. As standard hospital toxicology panels don't test for it, Kowalski said, when he judged that we had read enough. It's not on the routine screen. You'd have to know to look for it specifically, which means you'd have to already suspect it was there. He tapped the folder. Owen's independent toxicologist knew to look because Owen told him what he was looking for. I set the folder down. My hands were steadier than they had been yesterday. I had apparently used up my quota of visible emotion and crossed into a territory beyond it, a cold, functional place where everything was simply evidence to be processed. "When did you first suspect?" I asked Owen. Owen was staring at the folder. Not reading it, he had clearly read it before, probably many times. He was staring at it the way you stare at something you wish you could unknow. "December," he said. Her decline was too even, too consistent. Real neurological deterioration doesn't move in a straight line. It fluctuates, it plateaus, it has good days and bad days. Claire's numbers moved like a metronome. His voice was controlled, but it cost him something to keep it that way. I could see it in the tension across his shoulders, the way his hands had closed into loose fists on the table. I started researching compounds that could produce that pattern. TTX kept coming up. I brought in Dr. Ellison, a toxicologist out of Yale, in January. He confirmed it within 2 weeks. "And Claire," I said. "When did she—" "April." Owen looked up from the folder, and what was in his eyes in that moment was something I had no framework for: grief and relief and rage and love, all occupying the same space simultaneously, none of them winning. By April, the antidote protocol had cleared enough of the compound from her system that she regained full consciousness. She's been awake since April 15th. The number hit me like a physical thing. April 15th, nearly 6 months ago. My son's fiancée had been lying in a hospital bed, fully conscious for nearly 6 months, listening, thinking, watching, while the rest of us believed she was unreachable. Owen, my voice came out rougher than I intended. She has been awake for 6 months, and you didn't. I know. He cut me off, and for the first time his composure slipped just a crack just enough. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped, and he pressed the heel of his hand hard against the table's edge, like he needed something solid to push against. I know, Dad. I know exactly what I asked her to do. I know what it cost her. And I know what it would have cost her if Margaret had found out she was conscious before we had enough evidence to put her away permanently. His voice dropped to something very quiet and very hard. If Margaret knew Claire was awake, she would have increased the dosage overnight. We would have lost her. I was not going to lose her. The room felt very still. Kowalski was watching Owen with an expression that I recognized from 40 years of watching experienced investigators watch witnesses the look of a man who has heard this particular explanation before and has decided on careful reflection that he believes it. The nursing staff who knew, I said. How many? 3, Owen said. Carol Stanton and 2 nurses Claire specifically asked for. They adjusted the official records to show no improvement. They took the risk because they understood what was at stake. His mouth compressed. I will spend the rest of my life making sure those 3 women are taken care of. That's not negotiable. I thought about Carol Stanton in the conference room yesterday. Her shaking hands, her cracked voice, the anguish in her eyes when she said she should have woken up 6 months ago. She had known Claire was awake. She had been carrying that alongside everything else. What does Claire remember? I asked. Owen looked at me steadily. Everything, he said. Every visit, every word. She has a photographic memory for numbers. It's what makes her extraordinary at her job. She's been cataloging dates, times, observations. Everything Margaret said, everything Margaret did. A pause. She's ready to testify. Something moved through me that I didn't have a clean name for. Pride, perhaps. Or something larger than pride, the particular awe that comes from encountering a quality of courage so far outside the ordinary that your existing vocabulary doesn't quite reach it. A 26-year-old woman had chosen to lie still in a hospital bed for 6 months, fully conscious, in order to help build a case against the woman who was trying to kill her. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. Then let's make sure, I said, that when she walks into that courtroom, we have built her something worth walking into. I was not there when Margaret made her calls that night. I would reconstruct it later from Kowalski's surveillance logs, from phone records, from the particular trail of decisions that careful people leave behind when they believe they are being careful enough. But the picture that emerged was so precise, so deliberate, so utterly devoid of panic, that it kept me awake for several nights after I first saw it. She did not go home after she left the estate that morning. She went to the Hartford Civic Gala, the annual Charitable Arts Foundation dinner, 230 attendees. Black tie held at the Wadsworth Athenaeum on Main Street. She had been on the organizing committee for 3 years. Her name was on the program. Her table was front and center, 8 seats all filled with people whose names appeared regularly in the Hartford Courant Society pages. She arrived at 6:45. She was photographed with the mayor at 7:12. She embraced the hospital board chairman at 7:31. She sat beside the Episcopal bishop during the keynote and laughed at something he said, genuinely laughed, or the kind of laugh so well practiced it had become genuine, and the photographer from the Courant caught it, and it would run in the next morning's edition above a caption that read, "Margaret Sinclair Hargrove, longtime arts patron, attends annual gala. 230 witnesses, an airtight alibi constructed in real time in public with a photographer present." And underneath the table in her left hand, a secondary cell phone that had never been registered to any name. Kowalski walked Owen and me through the financial forensics the following morning with the methodical patience of a man who has explained complex mechanisms many times and has learned that the explanation is only useful if the listener can follow each step. The transfer originated from a Delaware LLC called Sinclair Advisory Group. He said, pulling up a chart on the laptop he'd positioned at the head of the table. That LLC held a single bank account at First Hartford Trust. The account was authorized under Margaret Sinclair Hargrove's name and signature. He clicked to the next screen. The funds moved through 4 intermediate wallets before reaching the final destination, a cryptocurrency account registered to a man named Dale Pruitt. "Who is Pruitt?" I asked. former medical orderly, lost his license in 2019 following an incident at a care facility in Bridgeport that we don't need to get into. Since then, he's worked as what I'd call a freelance problem solver for people who have money and problems they'd prefer not to discuss. Kowalski's voice carried no particular inflection when he said this, which somehow made it worse. He has 3 prior arrests, no convictions. He's careful. Not careful enough, Owen said. Not careful enough, Kowalski agreed. Here's the piece that matters. He clicked to a third screen, a transaction log with timestamps highlighted in yellow. This system requires 2-factor authentication. The account holder must personally confirm each transaction using biometric verification on a registered device, in this case, a thumbprint scan on a specific phone. The confirmation window is 15 minutes. You cannot delegate it. You cannot schedule it in advance. You have to be holding the phone when the window opens, and you have to press your thumb to the screen. He let that settle. The confirmation was executed at 9:47 p.m., he said. At 9:47 p.m., Margaret Sinclair Hargrove was seated at table 1 of the Hartford Civic Gala, in front of 230 witnesses with her left hand underneath the table. Owen made a sound, a short, hard exhale, the kind that isn't quite a laugh, but occupies the same space. She built her alibi and signed the order at the same time. In the same building, Kowalski said, with the bishop sitting next to her. The audacity of it made my stomach turn. Not with admiration, with something colder, something that recognized in Margaret's planning the particular quality of intelligence that becomes genuinely dangerous when it is entirely divorced from conscience. Anne Pruitt's assignment, I said. Kowalski pulled up a different screen, a surveillance photograph, grainy but clear enough. A heavy-set man in his mid-40s with the kind of face that looked like it had been arranged to be forgettable. His instructions were to gain access to Claire's room at Fairfield County Private, posing as a rotating staff member on the overnight shift. The target compound was potassium chloride administered intravenously in sufficient concentration to cause cardiac arrest. It presents in a patient with Claire's documented condition as natural organ failure. The words hit the room like something dropped from a height. Natural organ failure. A 26-year-old woman lying alone in a hospital room while the person who had ordered her death was laughing at a bishop's joke 2 miles away. I stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there for a moment looking at the parking structure across the street because I needed something entirely ordinary to rest my eyes on while I steadied myself. Meanwhile, on the other side of this operation, Edmund Holt was alone in the estate on Meadowbrook Lane. I did not know that yet, but the phone call Margaret made to Edmund that same evening, reconstructed later from tower data, and the testimony of a man who would not be alive to give it, went something like this. Edmund, you remember the arrangement we have? I need you to remember it very clearly tonight, because things are moving, and when things move, people make choices. And your choice, the only choice that makes sense for you, is to be very, very quiet. Edmund had been quiet for 8 years. He was good at it. He would be asked to do something far worse than quiet before this was over. I didn't know that yet either, standing at the window watching an ordinary parking structure and trying to remember how to breathe like a man who still believed the world was essentially navigable. Behind me, Kowalski was already on his phone, and Owen was already reading the next document, and the machinery of consequence was already turning quiet and inexorable in both directions at once. Before I reveal what happened inside that hospital room that night, comment ready, so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next changes everything. A reminder, this story carries fictional elements woven in for storytelling purposes. Some details may not reflect reality exactly. If that's not your thing, this is a good place to stop. But if you're staying, hold on tight. Kowalski called me at 2:34 in the morning. I was awake. I had been awake since midnight, sitting in the armchair by the window of my study, with Eleanor's letter on the side table and a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching the October darkness press against the glass and thinking about Dale Pruitt moving through a hospital corridor in borrowed scrubs. When the phone rang, I picked it up before the second vibration. "It's done," Kowalski said. "We have him." I closed my eyes, opened them. Claire. Safe. Exactly where we put her 2 nights ago. Pruitt never got within 400 yards of her. I pressed the phone hard against my ear and breathed through my nose for 3 full seconds. And Pruitt, in custody, not talking he lawyered up before we had him in the car, but we have him on attempted murder with about 6 witnesses and a body camera recording. A pause. "He's not going anywhere, Judge." I set the phone down after we finished and sat very still in the armchair for a moment, and then I got up and went to Owen's door and knocked twice. He opened it in 12 seconds. He had not been asleep either. "Kowalski called," I said. Owen's face did something complicated, relief and fury arriving simultaneously, fighting each other for the same real estate. He pressed one hand flat against the doorframe above his head and leaned into it hard like he needed the resistance. "Pruitt in custody. Claire safe." He made a sound against the doorframe, not a word, just a sound, the kind that comes out of a person when something they have been terrified of for a very long time has finally at last failed to happen. His shoulders dropped 2 inches, his jaw unclenched with an almost audible release of tension. "Come in," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Let me tell you how we got here." I sat in the chair across from Owen's desk, the same chair I had occupied 3 nights ago when I first heard the name Kowalski, and my son told me the story of the past 48 hours in the careful sequential way he did everything beginning to end. No editorializing, just the facts in the order they had occurred. 48 hours before Pruitt arrived at Fairfield County. Private hospital, Kowalski had pulled a federal protective custody order for Claire, the legal mechanism that allowed the FBI to assume responsibility for her safety and relocate her without public record. He had coordinated with the administration at a secure federal medical facility in New Haven, a unit attached to the district courthouse complex that handled witness protection. Medical cases, staffed by personnel with federal security clearances. Claire had been moved at 3 in the morning 2 nights ago. 2 FBI agents, a medical transport team, and a route that avoided every camera-equipped intersection between Fairfield County and New Haven. Her room at Fairfield County Private Room 412 had been prepared with what Kowalski called, with characteristic understatement, a biological simulation model. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. "It means a medical mannequin fitted with a cardiac monitor, a breathing apparatus, and a body temperature regulator," Owen said. "From the doorway in low light, with a quick visual check, it reads as a patient. It has a pulse. It has a respiratory rate. The IV line is live. It connects to a monitoring system rather than a patient. But if someone injects something into it, the compound gets captured and analyzed rather than administered." I thought about Pruitt approaching that bed in the dark, the practiced calm of a man who had done things like this before. The syringe in his hand, the moment he pressed the plunger. "He didn't realize until the lights came on," I said. "He had about 2 seconds," Owen said. "Kowalski had 4 agents in the room, 2 in the closet, 2 behind the privacy curtain, plus a camera running to the Hartford field office." He paused. "Pruitt dropped the syringe when they identified themselves. It hit the floor and cracked. The compound inside potassium chloride, just as the intelligence suggested, spread across the linoleum. A beat. The forensics team collected samples. We have his fingerprints on the syringe casing. We have him on video entering the unit with a falsified staff credential. We have 6 witnesses to the moment of arrest." "But he won't talk," I said. "He won't talk," Owen confirmed. His attorney, a very good one, who appeared at the Hartford field office within 90 minutes of the arrest, which tells you something about how prepared Margaret was for this contingency, has advised him to say nothing, and Pruitt is disciplined enough to follow that advice. I sat with that for a moment. Outside Owen's window, the October darkness was beginning to thin at the edges, the particular gray that comes before first light when the world hasn't yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. "She'll know by morning," I said, "that Pruitt was taken." "She probably knows already," Owen said. "She has contingencies. She'll be moving the moment she gets the signal." The word contingencies settled in the room like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Margaret had planned for the possibility of Pruitt's capture, which meant she had already decided somewhere, in that precise and terrible mind of hers, what her next move would be. I thought about Edmund Holt asleep, or not asleep in his rooms on the 3rd floor of the estate. 22 years of service. A man who knew every creak in the floorboards, every preference of every person who had ever lived in that house. A man who had listened to a phone call from Margaret 3 evenings ago, and agreed in his careful, exhausted silence to be very, very quiet. I thought about the green-shaded lamp on his desk still burning. He deserved better than what was coming. "We need to move faster," I said, and the urgency in my own voice surprised me. Not the courtroom voice, not the judge's measured cadence, but something rawer and more immediate than that. something that belonged to a father and not a judge. Whatever we're building, Dennis needs to accelerate it, because Margaret is already planning her next step, and I am not willing to find out what that step costs us before we're ready. Owen looked at me across the desk. His eyes were red at the rims from 2 nights without sleep, and his jaw was dark with stubble, and he looked like a man who had been running a very long race and could finally just barely see the finish line. "I'll call Kowalski at 6, he said. "We go to the next phase." I nodded. I stood. I crossed to the door and then stopped my hand on the frame because there was something I needed to say that I had not yet said, and I was old enough to know that unsaid things had a way of becoming permanent. "Owen," he looked up. "She's going to be all right. Claire." I said it like a statement, not a question, because I needed it to be a statement. "Whatever comes next, she is going to be all right." Owen's throat moved. He looked away from me for exactly 1 second toward the window and the first gray light pressing at the glass, and when he looked back, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Yeah," he said. "She is." I went to bed. The morning was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. The call came at 5:09 in the morning, 43 minutes after I had finally fallen asleep. I knew before I picked it up. I don't know how to explain that. With any precision, it was not intuition so much as the particular dread that accumulates when you have been waiting for something bad to happen and you have run out of arguments for why it won't. The phone number on the screen was the Greenwich Police Department's non-emergency line. I had been a Connecticut judge for 40 years. I knew every prefix in the state. I picked up, "Mr. Hargrove." The officer's voice was young and careful, the voice of someone who has been trained to deliver this kind of news, and is discovering in real time that the training doesn't fully prepare you. "This is Officer Reyes with Greenwich PD. I'm calling about a man named Edmund Holt. He's listed as a resident at your property on Meadowbrook Lane. Sir, I'm sorry to tell you that Mr. Holt was found deceased approximately 30 minutes ago in his private quarters." The word deceased has never sounded the way it should. It is too clean, too clinical, too composed for what it actually means. What it actually means is that a man who knew the name of every flower in my garden and the precise temperature at which I took my morning coffee was gone, and the house on Meadowbrook Lane had 1 fewer person breathing inside it. I sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the phone to my ear and said, "How?" "It appears to be a self-inflicted. There's a note, sir. We'd like you to come to the property if you're able." I was there in 22 minutes. The Greenwich PD had cordoned off Edmund's quarters on the 3rd floor, a modest suite of rooms he had occupied for the entire 22 years of his employment, furnished with the careful spare taste of a man who had long since made his peace with the difference between what he wanted and what he had. 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway. A detective named Hartley 50s Gray at the temples met me at the door with the expression of a man performing a routine he had performed many times before. "The note was on his desk," Hartley said. "Handwritten. He takes responsibility for hiring the individual apprehended last night at Fairfield County Private. States a personal grievance against the patient as the motivation." He paused. "It's fairly detailed, Mr. Hargrove." I looked at the room from the doorway. The desk lamp was still on the small green-shaded lamp Edmund had brought from his previous home, the one personal item he had kept from the life before this one. His chair was pushed back at an angle as though he had stood up in a hurry. On the desk beside the lamp, a folded piece of paper. Something was wrong. Not with the scene. The scene was composed, arranged internally, consistent in all the ways a scene is supposed to be when someone wants it to read as tragedy rather than crime. What was wrong was something I felt in the back of my skull behind my eyes, in the place where 40 years of reading contested evidence had built a kind of 7th sense for the gap between appearance and truth. Edmund Holt did not push his chair back at an angle when he stood. He pushed it straight. He had pushed it straight every day for 22 years, at every meal, at every desk, because Edmund was a man for whom the precise and the orderly were not habits but convictions. I had watched him stand from that chair 1,000 times. I called Kowalski at 5:47 a.m. "I need an independent forensic pathologist at the Meadowbrook Lane property," I said without preamble. "Today, before the county medical examiner files anything." "On what basis?" Kowalski said, and I could hear from his voice that he was already moving. "The chair is at the wrong angle," I said. Edmund Holt did not leave his chair at that angle, not once in 22 years. A pause. Then, "I'll have someone there by 8. The forensic pathologist Kowalski sent was a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, board certified, 20 years in federal forensic medicine, the kind of professional whose testimony had held up in 17 consecutive federal trials. She arrived at 7:58, examined Edmund's quarters for 2 hours without unnecessary conversation, and submitted her preliminary findings to Kowalski by noon. I read the report in the Hartford field office conference room, the same room where I had sat 3 days ago when this had all still seemed in some fraction of my mind, like something that might be resolved without further casualties. The compound present in Edmund's system was tetrodotoxin, the same compound that had been administered to Claire Donovan over 12 months. The concentration was approximately 20 times the maintenance dose that had been used on Claire, enough to cause rapid and irreversible neurological shutdown. There was no indication of voluntary ingestion. The compound had been introduced through a liquid medium, most likely the glass of water on his bedside table, within approximately 3 hours of the time of death. Edmund Holt had not written that letter by choice. He had written it, or more precisely been made to write it, in the hours before he died, under conditions that Dr. Okafor's report described with forensic precision as consistent with extreme psychological duress. He had been sitting at his desk when someone told him what to write. He had written it. And then someone had waited, and when it was done, they had added something to his water glass, and they had left. And Edmund had stood up from his chair in a hurry because something was wrong, and he had not had time to push it straight, and he had not had time for anything else either. I set the report down on the conference table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and stared at the wall across the room, which was an institutional beige that someone had chosen, specifically because it provoked no emotional response, and I was grateful for it. Kowalski sat across from me. He did not offer comfort because he understood that comfort was not what I needed. What I needed was for someone to sit in the same room with me while I moved through what I was feeling and came out the other side of it, and Kowalski, without being asked, provided exactly that. "She killed him," I said when I could say it. Not a question, not a theory. A fact stated in the flat declarative voice I had used for 40 years to read verdicts into the record. "Yes," Kowalski said. "The same compound." "Yes, which means our forensic evidence now connects 2 victims, 2 administrations, 1 source. That strengthens every charge." He paused. "It also means she's accelerating judge. She's past cautious now. She's into damage control. And damage control for someone like Margaret Sinclair Hargrove looks like elimination." I thought about Edmund's green-shaded lamp still burning on his desk. 22 years. The name of every flower. The temperature of my coffee. "Who else is exposed?" I said. Kowalski opened his folder. "Helen Marsh," he said. "Margaret's sister. Our surveillance suggests Margaret attempted to contact her twice last night. Helen didn't answer." I filed that away. Helen Marsh. A name I had never paid much attention to, Margaret's younger sister, occasional presence at family events. A quiet woman who smiled carefully and left early. "Find her," I said. "Before Margaret does." Kowalski was already picking up his phone. She was on television by 7 o'clock that evening. I was sitting in the kitchen of the estate, the first time I had sat in that kitchen in 3 days, because the house felt different now, with Edmund gone, the way a room feels different, when a piece of furniture that has always been in the same corner is suddenly absent. You don't notice the furniture until it isn't there. I had not noticed in 22 years how much of the house's particular rhythm had been Edmund, the sound of his footsteps in the morning, the precise timing of the coffee, the way every surface was always exactly as it should be. Owen had turned on the small television on the counter without comment, and we were eating sandwiches that neither of us particularly wanted. And then Margaret's face filled the screen, and I set my sandwich down and did not pick it up again. She was standing on the front steps of her attorney's office on Asylum Avenue, a choice of location that was either unconsciously ironic or precisely calculated, which with Margaret meant it was precisely calculated. She wore black, but not the aggressive declarative black of someone performing grief. She wore the considered, almost reluctant black of a woman who had not wanted to dress this way, who had reached into her closet that morning, hoping for something else, and found that nothing else was appropriate. She had been crying recently. Not currently she was composed, but recently in the past hour, carefully enough that her makeup remained intact. But her eyes carried the particular weight of someone who had spent genuine emotion and was now running on the reserves. I had put people on witness stands for 40 years. I knew the performance of grief. I also knew that the most convincing performances were the ones that incorporated something real. Edmund Holt served the Hargrove family faithfully for more than 2 decades. She said her voice pitched low and even calibrated to carry without seeming to project. He was a good man who made a terrible choice in a moment of, I can only imagine, profound pain and confusion. I don't want to speak ill of him. I want to grieve him. A pause the length of a breath, drawn carefully. What I cannot do is stand by while my stepson uses this tragedy to further a campaign of manipulation that has caused this family nothing but suffering. Owen beside me made a sound low in his throat, not a word. Not quite, but the kind of noise a person makes when something lands exactly on a bruise. Margaret turned slightly toward the cluster of microphones, and the camera caught her profile. The straight spine, the lifted chin, the expression of a woman bearing a public burden with private grace. Owen Hargrove staged a fraudulent wedding ceremony using a vulnerable woman's medical condition as theater, she said. He hired an actress to impersonate his own fiancée. He has made false accusations against me in front of witnesses, including a man of the cloth, in order to deflect attention from his own conduct. Her voice tightened just slightly in exactly the way a voice tightens when emotion is being held back rather than released. I have spent 8 years loving this family. I have supported Theodore through the grief of losing the wife he adored. I have tried to be present for Owen in every way he would allow. And this is what that love has cost me. She pressed her lips together, looked down for exactly 2 seconds, looked back up. I am asking the Connecticut courts to do what families cannot always do for themselves, she said, to look clearly at what is happening here, to protect the assets that Theodore and Eleanor Hargrove built together from a man who has demonstrated repeatedly that he cannot be trusted to steward them responsibly. The press conference ended. The screen cut to a news anchor summarizing the filing. Margaret's attorneys had submitted a petition to Connecticut Superior Court requesting the suspension of Owen Hargrove's authority over the Hargrove Family Trust on grounds of financial misconduct and psychological instability. The petition cited the fraudulent wedding ceremony, the death of Edmund Holt under circumstances connected to Owen's actions, and 3 financial decisions Owen had made in the past 18 months that Margaret's attorneys characterized as reckless. Kowalski called while the anchor was still talking. "She's good," he said without preamble, which from Kowalski constituted an extraordinary admission. "She's very good," I said. "The petition has teeth. Not enough to win on its merits, but enough to force a hearing, and a hearing means discovery, and discovery means our timeline gets complicated." He paused. "She's not trying to win in court, Judge. She's trying to slow us down long enough to clean up whatever we haven't found yet." I turned away from the television and looked out the kitchen window at the garden, where Edmund's roses were still blooming, in the October, cold, deep red, almost burgundy. The variety he had planted the first autumn he arrived, and tended every year since, with a patience and care that I had taken entirely for granted. "She invoked Eleanor," I said. "I heard. She said she supported me through losing the wife I adored." My voice came out very flat. "She moved into this house 14 months after Eleanor died. She wore navy to the funeral because she said black felt presumptuous for someone who hadn't known Eleanor long." A pause. "I thought that was considerate. At the time." Kowalski let that sit for a moment. Then, with the careful precision of a man who understood that some things needed to be said plainly and without softening. "She has been running this play for 8 years, Judge. Everything she did was designed to look like love. That's what makes her dangerous, and it's also what's going to make the jury hate her when they see it clearly." Across the kitchen, Owen had pushed his plate aside and was staring at the tabletop, with his jaw set and his shoulders rigid and every line of his body communicating the particular controlled fury of a man who is choosing very deliberately not to put his fist through the nearest wall. "Owen," I said. He looked up. His eyes were burning. "She just handed us something," I said. He frowned. "How?" "She went on television," I said. "She filed in court. She made her position a matter of public record with timestamps and documentation, and a paper trail that runs straight back to her. I picked up my coffee cold, but I needed something to hold. Every move she makes now is evidence. She knows that, and she did it anyway, because she believes she has more control over the narrative than we do." I set the coffee down. "She's wrong, but we need to be ready to prove it before the hearing." Owen held my gaze. Something shifted behind his eyes. The fury was still there, but behind it, something sharper and more useful was beginning to organize itself. "How long do we have?" he said. "Kowalski says the hearing will be scheduled within 3 weeks. I stood. My knees ached and I was tired in a way that went past sleep into something structural. Something that had to do with 8 years of misplaced trust and 22 years of an occupied corner now permanently empty. 3 weeks to finish what we started. I walked to the window and looked at Edmund's roses in the fading October light, and I made him a promise I did not say out loud, because I was a man who had spent his life in courtrooms, and I knew that the promises worth keeping were the ones that ended in verdicts, not words. 3 weeks. We had 3 weeks. It would have to be enough. She contacted me through Father O'Brien. Not directly, not a phone call or a message to the house. Nothing that could be traced or intercepted by someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to add to her list of casualties. She went to St. Anthony's on a Thursday morning, slipped into a pew near the back, and waited until Father O'Brien finished his morning prayers. Then she told him she needed to reach Theodore Hargrove privately, and she needed him to understand that privately meant without anyone else in the family knowing, and she needed it to happen today. Father O'Brien called me from the church's landline at 10:47. "There's a woman here who says she has something you need to see," he said in the careful, uninflected tone he used when he was relaying information he did not fully understand but had decided to trust. "She says her name is Helen Marsh." I was in the car within 4 minutes. Helen Marsh was 58 years old, and she looked at first glance remarkably like her sister, the same fine bone structure, the same gray-streaked dark hair worn close to the face, the same quality of controlled composure that the Sinclair women seemed to carry as a genetic inheritance. But where Margaret's composure was architectural, built, maintained, weaponized Helen's, was the composure of someone who was holding themselves together through sheer effort of will and was not entirely sure how much longer the effort would last. She was sitting in the third pew from the back when I arrived. Her hands were in her lap and they were shaking. Not trembling, shaking. The distinction matters. Trembling is what hands do when they are cold or tired. Shaking is what hands do when a person has made a decision that terrifies them and has committed to it anyway. I sat down beside her, leaving a pew's worth of space between us, and waited. "I saw the news about Edmund," she said. Her voice was low and hoarse, the voice of someone who had been crying recently and at length. I knew Edmund, not well, but I knew him. He used to bring in extra chairs when I came for Christmas because he remembered I had a bad back and the dining room chairs were too low. She stopped, pressed her lips together hard enough that they went white at the edges. "Margaret called me twice the night he died. I didn't pick up." "I know," I said. We were watching her calls. Something moved across Helen's face, relief, or the complicated cousin of relief, that arrives when you discover that someone else already knows part of the thing you've been carrying alone. "Then you know I'm not on her side in this. I want you to understand that. Whatever it looks like from the outside, I am not on her side. Tell me why you're here, Ms. Marsh." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a USB drive, small black, the ordinary kind sold in multi-packs at any office supply store. She held it in her palm for a moment, looking at it, and then she set it on the pew between us, with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something that has been very heavy for a very long time. 14 months ago, she said, Margaret invited me to her house for dinner. Just the two of us. She said she wanted to talk. She said she'd been under stress. She needed someone who understood the situation. Helen's jaw tightened. Margaret has always talked to me when she needed someone who wouldn't push back. I was that person. For most of my life, I was that person. She paused. Outside, through the high windows of the church, October light fell in pale columns across the stone floor. She told me about Claire that night, Helen continued. Not directly. Margaret never does anything directly. She talked around it. She described Claire as a problem, a complication. She used the phrase managed outcome at some point, which is the kind of language Margaret uses when she wants to discuss something terrible without saying the terrible thing out loud. Her voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, and she pulled in a sharp breath and steadied herself. I felt something was wrong. I didn't understand how wrong, so I turned on the voice recorder on my phone. I put it in my bag. I don't know why exactly. Instinct, maybe. Or the part of me that has known my sister my whole life and has always known underneath everything what she was capable of. I looked at the USB drive on the pew between us. Connecticut is a one-party consent state, I said. Under Section 52570D of the Connecticut General Statutes, a recording is legally admissible if at least one party to the conversation consents to being recorded. You were a party to the conversation. The recording is legal. Helen blinked. I didn't know that. I do, I said. What's on the drive? They have 47 minutes, she said, Margaret explaining in her own words what she intended to do to Claire. Why she needed to do it. How she planned to do it. Helen's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, and her hands started shaking again with renewed violence. She was very specific, Theo. She talked about the compound. She talked about the dosage. She talked about the timing relative to the audit report Claire had filed. She looked at me directly for the first time, and her eyes were red and raw and burning with something that I recognized from 40 years on the bench as the specific anguish of a person who has been complicit in something by silence and cannot unknow it. She talked about it the way you talk about a logistics problem. She was proud of it. She wanted someone to know how clever she'd been, and I was the only person she trusted enough to tell. The stone walls of St. Anthony's held the silence for a moment. Why didn't you come forward? I said. Not an accusation. A question asked the way I would ask a witness I was trying to understand rather than corner. Helen's hands clenched in her lap. Because in 2011 I was involved in a car accident, she said. I was at fault. A man was seriously injured. Margaret knew someone. She made certain records disappear. She made it so that the accident never officially happened. She closed her eyes briefly. She kept the documentation. Every piece of evidence that should have been destroyed. She told me very gently, very lovingly, the way she does everything that she would always protect me as long as we protected each other. Her voice broke fully on the last word, and she pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed through her fingers until she had herself back. I told myself Claire was being well cared for. I told myself maybe I had misunderstood. I told myself there were explanations. She opened her eyes, and they were wet and fierce and devastated all at once. And then Edmund died. And I understood that there are no explanations. There never were. And I will not be quiet any longer. I picked up the USB drive. It weighed almost nothing. Ms. Marsh, I said, I need you to understand something. Coming forward with this recording will mean disclosing the 2011 accident. It will mean scrutiny, possibly legal consequences, certainly public attention. I cannot promise you that this will be easy or that it will be without cost to you personally. Helen Marsh looked at me with the eyes of a woman who had been calculating costs for 14 months and had finally at last decided that the cost of not acting was the one she could not afford to pay. I know, she said. I'm here anyway. I closed my hand around the drive and stood. Father O'Brien, I said, turning toward the front of the church where the old priest had remained in quiet, respectful distance throughout our conversation, occupying himself with something near the altar that I suspected was less necessary than it appeared. Can Ms. Marsh stay here for a few hours? Somewhere quiet out of sight. Father O'Brien turned around with the expression of a man who had been waiting to be useful. I have a very comfortable rectory, he said, and an excellent coffee maker, and absolutely no interest in telling anyone who is or isn't making use of either. I called Kowalski from the parking lot with the USB drive in my breast pocket pressed against Eleanor's letter, and I thought about two women who had kept their silence for different reasons and had both eventually found their way to the same place. I have the recording, I said when he picked up. Helen Marsh, 47 minutes, Margaret's voice, her words, her plan in detail. I paused. And Dennis, she mentions the compound by name. On the other end of the line, I heard Kowalski exhale a long, slow breath of the kind that comes out of a careful man, when something he has been working toward for a very long time, finally at last, comes within reach. Get it to me, he said, today. Kowalski called it a breadcrumb trail. Not because it was obvious nothing Margaret had constructed was obvious, but because every crumb was there if you knew what bread looked like and were patient enough to follow it through the dark. He had been following it for 9 months. By the time he laid it out for Owen and me in the Hartford field office at 7 in the morning, on a Thursday, the trail was complete from one end to the other, and what it led to was so precise and so damning that I had to read it twice before I fully believed what I was seeing. Blockchain forensics, Kowalski said, pulling up the first screen on his laptop, works on a principle that most people who use cryptocurrency don't fully appreciate until it's too late. Every transaction is permanent. Every timestamp is immutable. You cannot edit the ledger, you cannot delete an entry, and you cannot, no matter how sophisticated your obfuscation, fully sever the chain between where money started and where it ended up. You can make the chain very long and very complicated. You cannot make it invisible. He clicked through to a chart, a web of interconnected nodes, each one representing a wallet or an account with arrows indicating the direction and sequence of transfers. The payment to Dale Pruitt originated from a cryptocurrency wallet registered to a Delaware LLC called Sinclair Advisory Group, he said. The transfer moved through 4 intermediate wallets, one in Wyoming, one on the Isle of Man, one in the Cayman Islands, one in Delaware again before landing in Pruitt's account. From the outside, if you're doing a quick look, it appears to be 4 completely unrelated entities making a series of unrelated transactions. He clicked again. But blockchain forensics allows us to follow the actual movement of value, regardless of how many wallets it passes through. The money doesn't change, it just moves. And when you follow the movement all the way back to its origin point, he clicked a final time, and the chart collapsed to a single highlighted node at its center. It leads here, a business account at First Hartford Trust, held by Sinclair Advisory Group, LLC, authorized under the signature of Margaret Sinclair Hargrove. Owen leaned forward in his chair. That's the connection to Margaret directly. That's the connection, Kowalski confirmed. But here's where it becomes something better than a connection. He pulled up a second screen, a transaction log with a single line highlighted in yellow. The transfer required 2-factor biometric authentication, specifically a thumbprint scan on a registered device within a 15-minute confirmation window. The window was system-generated. It cannot be scheduled in advance, it cannot be delegated, and it cannot be executed remotely from an unregistered device. He tapped the highlighted line. The confirmation was executed at 9:47 p.m. on the night of the Civic Gala. He let that land. Owen said very quietly, "She was at the gala at 9:47. She was photographed with the Episcopal bishop at 9:31, Kowalski said. Our surveillance footage puts her at table 1 in her seat from 9:15 through 10:20. 230 witnesses, a Hartford Courant photographer, and a security camera at the Wadsworth Athenaeum that captured her continuously for 63 minutes. He closed the laptop. She pressed her thumb to a phone under that table at 9:47 p.m. and authorized a payment to a man she hired to kill her stepdaughter-in-law, while the bishop was telling her a joke, while the photographer was loading a fresh memory card, while 230 people who would all swear in court that Margaret Sinclair Hargrove never left that room were eating their appetizers 12 feet away. The room held that for a moment. I had spent 40 years in courtrooms. I had built cases that rested on single pieces of evidence far thinner than this. What Kowalski had just described was not a thread. It was a cable, the kind of cable you could anchor a bridge to, and it ran from Margaret's thumbprint directly to Dale Pruitt's account, without a single gap in the chain. Will it hold? I asked. In court, federal standard. The blockchain evidence has been admitted in 17 federal cases in the past 4 years, Kowalski said. Our forensic accountant certified by the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is prepared to testify to the methodology and the findings. The biometric authentication record is documented in the platform's server logs, which we obtained through a federal subpoena. He paused. It will hold, Judge, but I want to be precise about what it proves. It proves the payment. It proves the timing. Combined with Pruitt's arrest at the hospital and the forensic evidence from Edmund's death, it builds a picture that a reasonable jury will have no difficulty interpreting. But it doesn't put her hand directly on the mechanism, Owen said. He was not pushing back. He was doing what Owen always did, identifying the gap before someone else could use it against them. Not alone, Kowalski agreed. Which is why we need everything together. The crypto trail, Helen's recording, the healthcare proxy forgery, the toxicological evidence from both Claire and Edmund, Dr. Okafor's findings, Carol Stanton's testimony. He spread his hands flat on the table. Individually, each of these things is strong. Together, they are overwhelming. No competent defense attorney walks into a courtroom against this package and advises their client to go to trial. Margaret will go to trial, I said. Both of them looked at me. She will, I said, because Margaret does not believe she can lose. She has never believed she can lose. That is her fundamental nature, and it is also her fundamental error. and it is the thing that has led her to this table in the end. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold an hour ago, and I had been drinking it anyway because the warmth was beside the point. She will walk into that courtroom believing she can still control the narrative, and when she discovers she cannot, she will discover it in front of a judge and a jury and a public record that will follow her for the rest of her life. Owen was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room's single window, Hartford was going about its Thursday morning, with magnificent indifference traffic on the street. Below a delivery truck, double-parked a woman in a red coat, walking fast with her coffee held in two hands against the cold. "There's one more thing," Kowalski said. He opened a folder paper this time, not a screen, which meant the contents were something he wanted to be able to hand across a table rather than display. He slid 2 pages toward me. We ran the full forensic analysis on Edmund's letter. The handwriting analysis confirms what you suspected. The pressure patterns and letter formation are consistent with a person writing under extreme physical and psychological duress. The content includes 3 factual errors about Edmund's own employment history that he could not have made voluntarily: wrong dates, wrong names, errors consistent with a person dictating from memory while severely impaired. I looked at the pages. Edmund's handwriting reproduced in high resolution the careful, slightly formal script of a man who had learned to write in a different era when penmanship still mattered. 3 factual errors: wrong dates, wrong names. Edmund Holt had worked for this family for 22 years. He knew the dates. He knew the names. He had known them the way he knew which chair I preferred at the dining table and exactly how long it took the kettle to boil on a winter morning. The errors were not mistakes. They were messages, the only ones he'd been able to send. My throat tightened to the point of pain. I set the pages down and pressed my hand flat over them for a moment, and then I lifted my hand and straightened my spine and looked at Kowalski across the table. "Build the package," I said. "Everything, ironclad. I want nothing loose, nothing that can be challenged on procedural grounds, nothing that gives a defense attorney even a single thread to pull." My voice came out very level and very cold the way it came out. When I had made a decision so complete that there was nothing left to feel about it except the intention to see it through. When we walk into that courtroom, I want it to be the last room Margaret Sinclair Hargrove ever stands in as a free woman. Kowalski picked up his pen, the one he had set down on the first morning of this, deciding he wouldn't need it. He started writing. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep again. This time, it wasn't dread. It was something closer to the feeling I had always gotten the night before, a verdict not fear exactly, but a heightened aliveness, every sense sharpened past comfort, the mind refusing to switch off because it understood that tomorrow mattered in a way that most days don't. I went to my study, old habit, the lamp, the desk, the smell of paper and leather. I picked up the notarized agreement Owen had produced at the ceremony, the version that had been handed to Margaret's attorneys as part of the civil proceeding, the one establishing that Owen waived all financial claims in the event of Claire's death. I had read it twice before. I read it again now, slowly the way I read everything when I needed to be certain rather than merely confident. Page 1, page 2, the standard language of a carefully constructed charitable bequest. Page 3, the signature block notarized by 3 independent attorneys whose credentials I had already verified. And then, at the bottom of page 3 in type slightly smaller than the surrounding text, a subsection I had not noticed in my 2 previous readings. Section 4, C. In the event of the death of Claire Elizabeth Donovan within 5 years of the execution of this agreement, for any reason the entirety of the Hargrove Family Trust, including all assets, holdings, properties, and future interests, shall transfer irrevocably to the Eleanor Hargrove Scholarship Foundation to be administered by its independent board of directors in perpetuity. Owen James. Hargrove retains no claim, interest, or benefit of any kind. I read it 3 times. Then I sat back in my chair and pressed both hands over my face. Owen had not just waived his claim to Claire's insurance money. He had wagered everything the entire Hargrove family trust, the estate, the investments, the 30 years of his father's professional life, translated into assets on Claire surviving. If Margaret had succeeded, if Claire had died, Owen would have lost not just the woman he loved, but every material thing he possessed and would ever possess. He had put everything on the table and told no one. I knocked on his door at 11:30. He answered in 12 seconds, still dressed. He hadn't been sleeping either. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I placed the agreement on his desk, open to page 3, my finger resting below section 4C. He looked at it. He looked at me. He didn't say anything yet, but his jaw tightened in the particular way it tightened when he was bracing for something. "When did you add this?" I said. "Before the ceremony," he said. 2 weeks before. I had it drafted separately and incorporated into the full version by a fourth attorney, someone Margaret's people had never encountered and wouldn't think to check. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something raw and undefended, that I hadn't heard from Owen since he was a boy. The version I presented at the ceremony was real. This version is also real. They're the same document. The full version went to Judge Owen's chambers and to the Secretary of State's office the day before the ceremony. "Why didn't you tell me?" Owen was quiet for a beat. Outside, the October wind moved through the old oak by the stone wall, and the sound it made was the sound of a house settling, of time, continuing of the world, going on regardless. "Because if you had known," he said, "and Margaret had somehow found out that you knew, she would have understood the full scope of what I was doing, and I needed her to believe right up until the moment she stood up in that ceremony that there was still something to gain." He met my eyes. "She had to believe the prize was real, otherwise she stays quiet. She waits, she finds another way, and Claire keeps lying in that bed." I looked at my son across the desk, 38 years old, gray at the temples now that I looked, when he had that happened. The boy who sat in a backyard for 3 days beside a broken bird had become a man who had quietly, methodically put every single thing he owned on the line for the woman he loved, and had not mentioned it to anyone, and had gone to bed every night for 2 weeks, carrying that knowledge alone. My throat ached. "She would have gotten nothing," I said. "Even if she had succeeded, even if Claire had—" I stopped, started again. "Margaret spent 8 years engineering this, and at the end of it, if she had won, she would have walked away with nothing." "I know," Owen said. "She doesn't know that." "No," he said, "she doesn't. And tomorrow in front of Judge Owens and whoever else is in that courtroom, she's going to find out." Something moved across his face. Not satisfaction exactly, but the particular deeply tired expression of a man who has been running a very long race and can finally at last see the tape. I stood, I crossed to the door, and then I stopped because Eleanor's letter was in my breast pocket and I was 70 years old, and there were things I had not said that needed to be said before tomorrow. "Owen," he looked up. "When your mother was dying, she made me promise to trust you, even when I didn't understand, even when I was afraid." I kept my voice level because some things are too important for the voice to break on. "I didn't do that well enough. I should have trusted you sooner. I should have trusted you when you walked into that living room 3 weeks ago and said 3 words. I held his gaze. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Owen's throat moved. His eyes went bright, and he looked away for exactly 1 second toward the window. And when he looked back, he said very quietly, "You're here now." 3 words. The same number he had used when I asked him why he wanted to marry Claire. I nodded, and I went to bed. And for the first time since this began, I slept without dreaming of anything at all. The Connecticut Superior Court on Washington Street smelled the way all courtrooms smell: old wood and floor wax, and the particular institutional staleness of a building that processes human conflict 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and has been doing so for long enough that the walls have absorbed it. I had walked into rooms like this one for 40 years. I had never once walked in from the wrong side of the bench. The disorientation was physical, a slight wrongness in my body's orientation, the way a musician might feel sitting in the audience at a concert hall where they had performed for decades. Everything was the correct shape and the correct distance, and yet nothing was quite where my instincts expected it to be. I sat in the chair to Owen's left and placed my hands on the table in front of me and told my instincts to be quiet. Margaret was already seated at the respondents' table when we arrived. She wore charcoal gray today, not black, which would have read as aggressive, and not anything lighter, which would have read as dismissive. Charcoal gray was the color of a woman who understood that she was in a serious room and intended to be taken seriously. Her attorney, a man named Caldwell, silver-haired and deliberate, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had won more civil cases than he'd lost, sat beside her with a legal pad covered in neat, small handwriting. Margaret looked at Owen when we entered. Not at me, at Owen. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has been grievously wronged and has chosen out of dignity rather than weakness not to show how much it has cost her. It was a remarkable piece of work. I had to admire it the way you admire a mechanism you have taken apart and understand completely, not with warmth, but with a cold and precise appreciation for the craft. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Judge Patricia Owens walked in, and the bailiff called the room to order, and everyone stood. Patricia was 68 years old and had been on the Connecticut bench for 26 years, the last 12 as a Superior Court judge in Hartford County. She had the silver hair and the straight spine and the particular quality of absolute authority that very good judges develop over time. Not performed authority, not borrowed authority, but the real kind, the kind that comes from having made 10,000 difficult decisions and standing behind every one of them. She and I had overlapped for 19 years. We had disagreed sharply on 3 cases and agreed on everything that actually mattered. She took her seat. She arranged her documents. She looked up, and for exactly 1 second, her eyes found mine across the courtroom. She did not nod. She did not smile. She simply held my gaze for the length of 1 heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, I understood that she knew exactly what was happening in her courtroom today, and was going to let it happen correctly. Then she looked away, and the hearing began. Caldwell opened for Margaret with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of a man billing $400 an hour and intending to earn every cent. He walked Judge Owens through the petition, in precise sequence: the fraudulent wedding ceremony, the death of Edmund Holt, under circumstances connected to Owens' scheme, the 3 financial decisions Owen had made in the past 18 months that Caldwell characterized as reckless departures from the conservative stewardship the Hargrove Trust demanded. He submitted 37 pages of supporting documentation. He cited 6 Connecticut precedents for the suspension of trust management authority. He spoke for 22 minutes without a single unnecessary word. It was, I thought, watching him with the involuntary professional respect of one skilled practitioner for another, an excellent opening. It was also, I knew the entire substance of what Margaret had. She had made it look like more than it was. She was very good at that. But Caldwell's 22 minutes represented the whole of her hand played out in public, and now it was on the table. Then he addressed the alibi. My client was present at the Hartford Civic Gala on the evening in question. Caldwell said, with the easy confidence of a man presenting a fact rather than an argument, "She is documented by photography, security footage, and the personal recollection of more than 200 attendees, including the Episcopal Bishop of Connecticut, from the time of her arrival at 6:45 p.m. until her departure at 10:30. She did not leave the building. She did not make any phone calls. She had no involvement in the events at Fairfield County Private Hospital that evening, and the suggestion that she did represents an attempt by the respondent to deflect responsibility for his own conduct onto an innocent woman." He sat down. Judge Owens looked at our table. Counselor Owens' attorney, a younger woman named Reeves, who had been recommended by Kowalski, and who had the kind of focused, slightly dangerous energy that the best trial attorneys carry into a room, the way other people carry briefcases, stood up. She submitted the blockchain forensics package first. Kowalski's forensic accountant walked Judge Owens through the methodology in 11 minutes. The immutable ledger, the wallet trail, the 5-company structure, the 2-factor biometric authentication that could not be delegated, the timestamp at 9:47 p.m. Caldwell objected twice. Judge Owens overruled him twice without looking up from the documentation. Then Reeves submitted the healthcare proxy forgery analysis, Dr. Okafor's forensic document examination, the signature comparison, the probate court filing that gave Margaret unrestricted access to Claire's room for 11 months. Caldwell's 3rd objection was slightly less smooth than the first 2. Then, Reeves submitted the toxicological evidence, the TTX analysis, the dosage pattern, the correlation between Margaret's access dates, and the spikes in Claire's compound levels. Caldwell didn't object to that one. He made a note on his legal pad instead, and the note I noticed was considerably longer than the others. Margaret was still, perfectly, precisely still. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and her face was composed, and she was looking at a fixed point on the wall above Judge Owens' head, with the concentration of a woman who is using every available resource to hold herself together, and is not yet certain she has enough. Judge Owens read through the submissions in silence that stretched for 4 minutes and felt considerably longer. Then she looked up. "Before I address the evidentiary questions," she said in the measured, deliberate cadence that I had heard her use when she was about to say something that would change the direction of a proceeding, I want to note for the record that the court has received in advance of this hearing certain materials filed under seal by the Office of the United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut. She paused. Those materials include a federal arrest warrant for Margaret Sinclair Hargrove issued this morning on charges that include. The courtroom door opened, not quietly, not with the polite managed entrance of a late attorney or an early witness. It opened the way doors open when someone on the other side of them has been waiting for exactly this moment and has finally at last been given permission to walk through. And the woman who walked through it was someone I had last seen, lying still in a hospital bed, unresponsive, unreachable, a woman the doctors had told us with increasing and terrible gentleness might never come back. She walked in on her own 2 feet. Before I reveal who walked through that courtroom door, comment justice, if you've been here from the beginning. Because what happens in the next few minutes is the moment this entire story has been building toward. This story contains fictional elements crafted to carry a message worth hearing. Names and settings may be coincidental, but the truth inside this story that belongs to all of us. She walked in on her own 2 feet. Claire Donovan was 26 years old, and she was wearing a white button-down shirt and dark slacks, and her hair was pulled back from her face, and she looked. There is no other word for it, and I am a man who has spent his life being precise about words. She looked completely, entirely, heartbreakingly alive. Not recovered, not pale and fragile in the way of someone who has been through an ordeal and is doing their best. Alive in the way that a person is alive when they have decided, with the full force of their will, to be present in a room and to let that presence be felt. Her color was good, her chin was level. She walked down the center aisle of that courtroom, the way she had walked into my study 2 years ago with a battered leather satchel and an error she had found in a document that 3 other people had missed, like a woman who knew exactly where she was going and why, and was not going to apologize for either. Behind her came a man I had not seen in person before, but recognized immediately from Kowalski's file photographs. Dr. Warren Fisk was 53 years old, internist with a specialty in pharmacology who had maintained a private consulting practice in Westport for 11 years. He was a slight man, pale in the way of someone who had not been sleeping well, and he walked into the courtroom with the careful, deliberate posture of a man who has made a decision he knows will cost him considerably and has decided to pay the price anyway. His cooperation agreement with the United States Attorney's Office, a formal immunity arrangement in exchange for complete and truthful testimony, had been signed 48 hours ago. Under its terms, charges stemming from his role in administering the compound to Claire would be deferred pending his cooperation, with full dismissal contingent on his complete disclosure. Owen stood up from his chair the moment Claire came through the door. He didn't move toward her. He simply stood the way a person stands when their body responds to something before their mind has fully processed it. And he looked at her, and whatever was on his face in that moment was the most private thing I had ever witnessed my son experience in public. Claire looked at him. Her eyes went bright and fierce and full, and she pressed her lips together hard for exactly 1 second. And then she said, across the width of that courtroom, in a voice that carried all the way to the back wall, "I told you I'd be here." Owen's breath came out of him in a long, slow exhale that sounded like something he had been holding for a very long time. Judge Owens, to her credit, gave the room exactly 4 seconds before she brought it back to order. Fisk took the stand first. He identified himself, stated his credentials, and then, with the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has decided that the only thing left worth doing is telling the truth completely, he described his role in Margaret's operation over the preceding 14 months. He named the compound. He described the dosage protocol. He detailed the method of administration, the secondary access credential, the substituted medications, the careful calibration designed to keep Claire in a state of induced neurological suppression without triggering the kind of acute crisis that would prompt an independent investigation. And then he described the phone call he had received 8 days after Pruitt's arrest. She told me to leave Connecticut," he said. "She said there would be funds transferred to an account I would be given access to. $200,000. His voice was steady, but his hands resting on the railing of the witness box were not. They were shaking with a fine, persistent tremor that he appeared to have given up trying to control. I understood what the money meant. I understood what leaving meant. He looked at Judge Owens directly. "I contacted the FBI the same afternoon. Kowalski stepped forward from his position near the side door and placed the audio device on the clerk's table. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom, clear, composed, utterly recognizable. She discussed the compound by its chemical name. She described the timing relative to Claire's audit report with the precision of someone recounting a project timeline. She used the phrase "managed outcome" twice. At one point, she laughed a small, satisfied sound and said that the beauty of a slow method was that it gave everyone time to adjust to the idea of an inevitable conclusion. The courtroom was absolutely still. I watched Margaret while the recording played. She had stopped looking at the fixed point on the wall. She was looking at the table in front of her, and her hands, which had been folded with such perfect composure since the moment we had entered this room, had come apart. Her fingers were pressed flat against the table's surface, and the pressure was turning her knuckles the color of old paper, and she was breathing in the careful, controlled way of a person who was using every remaining resource to prevent something from happening and losing. When the recording ended, Judge Owens looked at the room for a long moment. Then she said, "Bailiff." Judge Owens did not immediately act on her own word. She let the bailiff move to his position near the respondent's table, close enough to be unmistakable, far enough to be professional, and then she looked at Claire and said, "Ms. Donovan, the court has been informed that you wish to offer testimony. Are you prepared to do so?" "Yes, Your Honor," Claire said. "I am." She walked to the witness stand with the same steady, deliberate pace she had used coming through the door. No hesitation, no performance of courage, just the actual thing, which is quieter and more frightening and more real than the performed version. She sat down. She placed both hands flat on the railing in front of her, and then she looked at Margaret for the first time since entering the courtroom. Margaret looked back. Something moved between them across the width of that room, not words, not gesture, just the particular quality of a gaze between a person who has done a terrible thing and the person it was done to, with full knowledge on both sides of exactly what passed between them. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Claire turned away and faced Judge Owens, and the turn was clean and final, the movement of a woman who has looked at something for the last time and is done with it. "Ms. Donovan," said Reeves, standing at the attorney's table, "please tell the court your professional role in relation to the Hargrove Family Foundation." "I am a certified independent financial auditor," Claire said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, with the particular precision of someone accustomed to presenting complex financial data to people who need to understand it. "My firm was retained by the Hargrove Foundation's Board of Directors in January of last year to conduct a comprehensive annual review of the Foundation's accounts disbursements and grant records for the preceding fiscal year." "And what did you find?" Claire reached into the folder she had carried to the stand and produced a document 47 pages, spiral-bound with tabbed sections. She held it up for the clerk, who logged it into evidence, and then she set it on the railing in front of her and opened it to the first tabbed section. "I found $5,214,000 that had left the Foundation's primary operating account through a series of transactions structured to resemble legitimate grant disbursements," she said. "The receiving entities were 4 nonprofit organizations registered in 3 states. None of them had verifiable staff programming, physical premises, or charitable activity of any kind." She turned to the second tab. "The authorization signatures on each disbursement were those of the Foundation's co-administrator." She looked up. Margaret Sinclair Hargrove. Caldwell began to rise. Judge Owens looked at him. He sat back down. "Ms. Donovan," Reeves continued, "when did you file your preliminary findings?" "March 14th, Claire said. "I submitted a preliminary report to the full board of directors, documenting the anomalies and recommending an immediate forensic audit and suspension of disbursement authority pending investigation." "And what happened 7 days later?" Claire's hands stayed flat on the railing. Her voice stayed even, but something moved through her eyes. Not grief, not fear, something older and colder and more resolved than either of those things. "On March 21st, she said, "I was driving to a client meeting on Route 44 when my car's braking system failed on a downhill curve. The vehicle left the road. I was found unconscious by a passing motorist and transported to Fairfield County Private Hospital, where I was admitted to the intensive care unit. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling." "Ms. Donovan," Reeves said carefully, "in the months following your admission to Fairfield County Private, were you aware of what was happening around you?" You're downed, they're forced, damned. From April 15th of this year, yes, Claire said. Fully aware, I could hear conversations, distinguish voices, process information. I understood where I was and why I was continuing to appear unresponsive. A pause, brief and precise. I want to be clear about what those months were like. I lay in a hospital bed completely conscious while doctors discussed my prognosis over me, while nurses adjusted my IV lines, while people I trusted came and went. She stopped. When she continued, her voice had dropped by exactly one register, not breaking, but waited. And while Margaret Sinclair Hargrove visited my room on 11 separate occasions, stood at my bedside and spoke to me in the kind and sorrowful voice of a woman who loved me and was grieving my condition. She reached to the third tab in the audit report and turned it to face the room. These are the dates of her visits, she said, and these, she turned to the fourth tab, are the dates on which the compound levels in my blood work showed statistically significant increases. There is a direct and consistent correlation between every visit Margaret made to my room and a subsequent spike in the substance Dr. Fisk has already identified for this court. Caldwell was on his feet. Objection. Your Honor, the witness is drawing a causal conclusion from overruled, Judge Owens said. The witness is presenting documented correlating data from her own medical records. She may continue. Silence. Then Reeves said, Ms. Donovan, is there anything further you wish to submit to the court? Claire reached into the folder one final time and produced a small evidence bag, a USB drive labeled with a case number in Kowalski's handwriting. This recording was made by Helen Marsh. She said, Who is Margaret Sinclair Hargrove's sister in July of last year? I have listened to it in its entirety. The voice on the recording is one I know very well. She set it on the railing. In it, Margaret describes her plan to prevent me from filing my audit report. She describes the compound she intended to use. She describes the accident on Route 44 as something she was, and I am quoting, directly taking care of. The room came apart. Not loudly, this was a courtroom, and Judge Owens had it well in hand, but a sound moved through those assembled that was not quite a gasp and not quite a word, the involuntary exhale of people hearing the last piece of a thing click into place. I was watching Margaret. I had been watching her for the past several minutes, the way I had watched defendants for 40 years, looking not at the face they were presenting, but at the face underneath it, the one that emerged when the presented one ran out of resources to maintain itself. The presented face was gone. What remained was something I had glimpsed only once before for a fraction of a second at the ceremony when Owen had tipped his hand, and she had not yet had time to reconstruct her expression. The calculating quality. The cold assessment of options. But this time, there were no options left to assess. Her hands came off the table. She pressed them into her lap, and she pressed her lips together, and she looked at the floor, and for the first time in the 8 years I had known Margaret Sinclair Hargrove, she looked like exactly what she was. Judge Owens spoke. Margaret Sinclair Hargrove. Her voice filled the room with the particular undecorated authority of a judge who has presided for 26 years and has never once needed to raise it. Pursuant to the federal arrest warrant issued this morning by the United States Attorney for the District of Connecticut, and in light of the evidence presented in these proceedings, this court orders that you be remanded immediately into federal custody. She looked at the bailiff. Take her into custody, please. 2 court officers moved to the respondent's table. Behind them, 2 federal agents I had not noticed until this moment stepped forward from their positions near the side door. The warrant had been ready since morning. They had simply been waiting for this room. Margaret did not resist. She stood slowly, carefully, with a terrible final dignity, and she extended her wrists and the handcuffs closed, and the sound they made was very small in that large room, but I heard it. I think everyone in that room heard it. She was walked toward the side door, and as she passed the end of the table where Owen and I were sitting, she stopped. The officers gave her the half-second she asked for. She looked at me, not at Owen, at me, and her expression was one I had no framework for, something that might have been regret and might have been fury and might have been neither. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. The door closed behind her, and the room exhaled. Across the courtroom, Claire Donovan was still sitting at the witness stand. She had her hands folded in her lap now, and her eyes were very bright, and she was looking at Owen with an expression so unguarded and so complete that I had to look away from it, not because it was painful, but because it belonged to them and not to me. I looked down at the table in front of me instead. In my breast pocket against my ribs, Eleanor's letter pressed warm and steady the way it had pressed all morning, the way it had pressed since the night I found it in the drawer. He commits completely, she had written, without any guarantee of a good outcome. She had been right about our son. She had been right about everything. The sentencing took 11 minutes. Judge Castellano, not Patricia Owens, who had recused herself, given her history with me, but a man with the reputation of being moved by nothing except evidence, read the charges without inflection and delivered the sentence without ceremony, life without the possibility of parole. Margaret stood at the table in a gray prison pullover, spine, straight eyes forward, composure intact. She had worn that composure like armor for 8 years. She wore it now because it was the only thing she had left, and she was not the kind of woman who surrendered the last thing she had. I understood that about her even now. I understood it, and I felt nothing about it except a cold, clear recognition that some people choose who they are all the way to the end. The court officers came. She walked out. The door closed. That was the end of 8 years. I stayed in my chair after the room emptied. Kowalski came and sat beside me, not to speak, just to be present, which was the right thing to do and which I was grateful for. He put a hand briefly on my shoulder, the way men of a certain generation do, when words would cost more than their worth, and then he left, and I sat alone until the afternoon light through the courtroom windows went thin and gray. I thought about Edmund, his green-shaded lamp still burning, his roses in the garden that I had decided somewhere in the past few weeks to learn the names of. It seemed like the least I could do. It seemed like the most I could offer. 3 weeks later, it snowed. The second Saturday of December brought a pewter sky and a light, steady snow that started at dawn and hadn't stopped by the time Father O'Brien arrived at the estate. His silver hair dusted white, his vestments pressed his face, carrying the particular warmth of a man who has presided over the worst and best of a person's life and considers that an honor. He opened his arms when he saw me crossing the garden toward him. I let him embrace me, which I did not always allow, and I held on a moment longer than I intended. "Twice in 3 months," he said. "I know," I said. "How are you holding up?" He laughed a real one, full and easy. "I'm a priest, Theo. This is exactly what I'm for." Owen stood at the end of the garden path, in a dark suit, his hands loose at his sides, watching the corner of the house where Claire would appear. He had the look of a man who had run a very long race and could see the finish line and did not trust himself to believe it was real until it arrived. Then Claire came around the corner. She wore ivory, simple, long-sleeved against the December cold, with white flowers in her hair and white roses in her hands, and the expression of a woman who has been through something considerable and has come out the other side, knowing exactly what she wants, and intending to say so clearly in front of witnesses. She was incandescently happy. She was not hiding a single degree of it. Owen's face changed. I will not try to describe it with precision because some things resist precise description. I will only say that the boy who sat beside a broken bird for 3 days in a backyard, who had bet everything he owned on one outcome, who had driven to Fairfield County every Sunday for 12 months, to read to a woman who couldn't answer, that boy was in my son's face, completely unguarded, and he was not ashamed of it. Nor should he have been. The vows were short and certain. Owen's voice did not waver. Claire's hands holding his did not shake. Father O'Brien pronounced them married, and the people in that garden who had all of them been holding their breath for months exhaled together, and it was the best sound I had heard in a very long time. Owen pulled me into an embrace when I reached him. He was not a man who did that. I held on longer than I planned. Later, Claire found me at the edge of the garden, where the snow had stopped and the December sky had gone that particular deep cold blue that only happens in Connecticut in winter. She pressed her face against my shoulder and said quietly, "Thank you for trusting him." I cleared my throat. "Thank you," I said, "for giving him someone worth trusting for." Kowalski appeared with 2 cups of coffee, real coffee. He handed me one and stood beside me and looked out at the garden, where Owen and Claire were laughing with Carol Stanton in the last of the afternoon light. "How does it feel," he said, "now that it's done?" I thought about Edmund's roses, Eleanor's letter in my breast pocket, 40 years of verdicts, and this one the only one I had ever built as a father rather than a judge. "Like repair," I said. "Something broken was repaired. That's rarer than justice, and harder to come by." Kowalski nodded slowly. "For a retired judge," he said, "you did pretty good." "I had help," I said. The white roses on the garden tables caught the last of the light and held it the way certain things do before the evening came. People ask me what this family story taught me. It taught me that family betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives in 8 years of quiet mornings and a warm smile across the breakfast table. Don't be like me. I spent 40 years reading criminals in courtrooms and missed the one sitting in my own home. My personal belief, the most dangerous betrayal is the one disguised as love. And the most powerful thing a person can do is choose to trust anyway the right person for the right reasons at whatever cost. Owen did that. Claire did that. I almost didn't. I am not a man who prays often, but in that December garden with Eleanor's music in the cold air and my son finally at peace, I looked up and said, "Thank you." Just that. I think God understood. This is a family story about what family betrayal costs and what rebuilding costs even more. I hope it stayed with you. If it did, leave a comment telling me which moment hit hardest. Share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. Upcoming stories contain fictional elements built for reflection and education. If that's not for you, choose freely. If you're staying, I'm glad you're here.